Sabina Brennan, thanks so much for joining me on the Mindful podcast.
Dermot Whelan, thanks very much for having me on the Mindful podcast.
I'm so excited to talk to you. Our paths have crossed over the years, and we've got to delve into all kinds of interesting spaces. Today's space I want to go into is flow state, because it's one of those elusive things, and a lot of sort of states that we're aware of and that we're, that science is aware of. A lot of the time we can sort of actively put ourselves into those, whether it's a state of relaxation or, awareness or whatever that happens to be. But with flow state, it's kind of elusive. Certainly it appears that way to me, in that it's a little bit like we're chasing a shadow a lot of the time. And that if you hear from athletes or, performers or, that they manage to get into this space, but then suddenly they were kicked back out of it. And for them, it seems to be a constant quest to get into that zone, as it's referred to, as many times as possible, because that's where the magic happens. So how true is any of that?
Yeah, it is where the magic happens, I think. I think it's in the zone, and flow was, the concept of flow was coined by a researcher, a Hungarian researcher. He lived in the US at the time, and he has one of those names that you really just have to learn how to pronounce. The way I do it is phonetically. So it's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. That's his name. And Mihai is spelled something like Mikhal. So Mihai.
I'm glad you said it, because I'd come across his name before, but it was one of those ones that you go, do you know what? I think I'll leave that to the experts. So thank God you're here.
Yes. So anyway,
but the work he did, I guess, is more important than how he pronounces his name.
He's he became fascinated with happiness and how people can experience enjoyment despite horrific things happening around them. And that kind of came out from the war and some people who, were subjected to horrific, all those terrible things that happened during the war, or indeed any disaster. And yet some people seem to be able to continue to enjoy life despite that. And that's where he sort of started his research from. And he, first of all, did tons of interviews, thousands of interviews with people all across the globe to try and understand what he ultimately called the state of flow.
And did he call it flow state? I read somewhere, because when his subjects in these studies were trying to describe things they were experiencing, they kept referring to water. They kept using like water analogies.
Right.
So this is where the term flow state came from.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Actually, I'm not aware of that. But the interesting thing that he found was that there was commonalities regardless of your culture, regardless of the activity that you were engaging in, whether it's, we hear a lot, you just mentioned it, a lot about sport, etc. But other people experiencing flow, doing more mundane things or things that you and I might not find enjoyable. And he kind of then teased apart about 8 components that he felt were necessary for flow.
Yeah, well, let's drill down into those a little bit, because I'd like people to kind of understand what it is and what's happening and what they're experiencing. And I know that one of those factors that he said encompassed flow was intense and focused concentration on the present moment. So obviously, as a meditation teacher, that's a space that I'm trying to get people into the whole time. So in terms of bringing ourselves into the present moment, that seems to be a byproduct. It's almost like the opposite to meditation, where we're trying to put ourselves in there. It's something that sort of comes out of flow.
Yeah, so that's rather interesting. So he would actually, you've said focused and with meditation, on the present moment, but actually he characterizes as those 2 different things. One is attention, and the other is being in the moment. So he classifies those as 2 separate things. The attention bit is the attention. Really interestingly, it's a high energy activity for your brain. You have attention is hard work.
Yeah.
You know that if you've been focusing on something all day, and you go, oh my God, I'm exhausted, I can't do anything else. So it burns up a lot of energy in your brain, and it's a limited resource, okay? So what seems to happen is if you are fully focused on the task at hand, there is no energy available to be doing those other things that can get in the way of flow that you're talking about. There's no energy for that voice in your head to say, you're not good enough to do this. Oh my God, I wonder what other people are thinking of. Thinking of me doing this. You're totally focused on the flow. Similarly, the moment, being in the moment, it's very similar, but there's kind of subtle differences in that you are really very present at that time. So they're all interlinked. He says 8, but they are so kind of interlinked. It's hard to separate them apart.
Know one of them is a loss of reflective self-consciousness, and that's pretty much what you said in terms of you're not in a state where you're looking at yourself and worried about how you're performing or whether you're going to fail, or what people may think of you. You're not in that state.
No, you're not. And what's really interesting, because I liked it. So basically, Mihai is a psychologist, and so all his research has sort of followed, that whole psychological thing. He gradually, made advances to how he gathered information, and then other people have built on that. So there's a huge body of research behind this concept of flow. What I'm interested in as well, and I think you are too, is kind of the neuroscience as well, like what's going on in our brain when we're in flow. So that's what's really interesting. So I have to say for your listeners, really the neuroscience research around flow is in its infancy, so there's still a lot to learn, but there's some really exciting things have come out. And one of those is related to that. So that the frontal lobes of your brain, there's a particular area there that's involved in that self-awareness, self-judgment, that sort of thing. And what's really interesting is when people are in the state of flow, there is a sort of damping down of activity in that area. It's actually called a hypofrontality, hypo as opposed to hyper. So you become less frontal, and that accounts for obviously that ability to not be passing judgment or not be the observer. But it's they're all so intertwined, and in some ways, to a listener, it might sound kind of complex. The thing is, he tends to start with you need clarity. You need clarity of purpose, clarity of goal, your long-term goal and your short-term goals. I suppose to put it in context, he talks about the pursuit of happiness as not being the way to find happiness. Really happiness comes from within, not those external things that we all kind of work towards. It's actually from that inner enjoyment that you get during flow. And he distinguishes between enjoyment and pleasure. Do we necessarily enjoy what we're doing if we're in flow state? Because I'm kind of thinking of, say, the situation where something extreme happens and somebody, a bystander suddenly jumps to someone's assistance and does something quite heroic. And in that moment, they're not thinking about themselves. They're not worried what people might think. They just spring into action. Time seems to move differently when they're in that space. Yeah. So it may not be a very enjoyable thing to be, lifting an overturned car off somebody, but they still may be in a flow state during that thing. So our friend Mihai would argue that that's not the case, that flow is enjoyment, that you have to experience enjoyment. And he argues that he draws a distinction between pleasure and enjoyment, Pleasure being something that everybody can experience, So we all get pleasure from eating. And that goes back to its survival value, So and it's the way our brains are set up. So when we eat food, we activate, dopamine is released. When we activate the pleasure centers in our brain and the reward centers in our brain, it really is enjoyable to eat food. Now, the reason dopamine is activated and the reason it's pleasurable is not for the sake of it being pleasurable. It is to motivate us to eat again, to engage in that behavior again. Otherwise, we will die. Similarly with sex, it's pleasurable because it activates dopamine, and dopamine is the motivator that gets you to do it again. Okay, so his argument is everybody can do that, but over time you eventually become satiated when you eat enough food. You know, I don't know about sex, but you know what I mean. And his argument, he actually he talks about a very interesting thing in sex, and he then goes across sort of to yoga and kundalini and about how you can actually make sex more of a flow state by actually, he calls it increasing your complexity, you know, your ability to do anything, you know, and this is important for flow too, is that there must be a balance between your skill level and the challenge that you're facing in flow. So flow always involves some sort of little challenge. There's a bit of a kind of a Goldilocks with flow. If your skill set is not up to the challenge, to the thing that you're trying to do, you'll feel frustration. You definitely won't get into flow.
Yeah.
You'll be frustrated because you can't do the thing. If your skill set is way beyond the challenge of the activity, you will soon become bored. And there's plenty of energy left over, attentional resources left over to engage in something else. So you want this Goldilocks moment, not exactly where flow and the challenge are exactly matched. There needs to be a slight bit of challenge. When I talk about brain health, so much of this speaks to the brain health that I advocate as well. It's the challenge. In the challenge really is a critical component, because you're pushing yourself, and in pushing yourself you're getting this enjoyment, you're getting this sense of satisfaction that you've increased something. You're also on an ongoing basis increasing your own complexity as a human. And again, Mihai talks about, you know, it's not to think about flow as these isolated incidences of, I was such in the flow, can't wait for that to happen again. But rather that it being a continuous story of your life where you're constantly moving within a flow that moves towards a longer term goal, but you're getting enjoyment from the journey. Essentially, you know, the fundamental thing about flow is that it is the journey that gives us happiness, that gives us enjoyment, rather than the end result. Because anybody who's achieved anything knows that you feel elated when you get there, you know.
Yeah.
Ask any runner, ask anyone who, you know, when you get to writing the end of a book, yes, I did it, I got there. But, you know, that calms down after a while, and then you're kind of bored, or is that it?
Yeah.
Is that it? You could become disenchanted. But no, what you've got to do is, well, okay, what's the next thing I want to do? What's my next challenge? And you get clarity about what your next challenge is, what your next goal is. And then you start working on improving your skill set to that next goal.
Well, the Goldilocks balance that you spoke about there makes sense if you look at sport in general and people who excel. Most of their celebrated flow state moments would probably be in that earlier part of their career, where as you say, their talent is still rising. They're still challenging themselves every day, and they're finding these moments of brilliance. And then I guess towards the end of, say, a footballer's career, there are less of those heroic, you know, moments where for them, as they used to describe, time would slow down, and you know, and maybe it's because
they beat their own record, or they match someone else's record, or they beat a record.
So there's less to play for, maybe. You know,
so
less juice.
Well, you see, that's the interesting thing. If you just stay focused on sort of one thing rather than it being an ongoing, continuing story. You know, they can still be related, like a fabulous footballer becoming a soccer manager, or a coach, or whatever. You know, they no longer play, but they're getting their buzz out of transferring their knowledge and making a team, you know, perform well. It kind of changes. I think it becomes problematic if you don't move on from that.
Obviously I'm mindful of the people listening who may not be world-class professional footballers, or F1 drivers, or, you know, famous actors, or any of those kinds of things. Where do we experience flow state in day-to-day life that maybe we don't even recognize it for what it is.
Yeah, this is the thing.
And why do we need it? Well, why is it a good thing?
So two things. I was going to kind of come in with an everyday example, but before I do that, for fear I forget to say it again, at the very start you were talking about how difficult flow seems complex to do. It's a bit like, dieting sounds so very easy. You just need to eat less calories, then you burn off and you lose weight. But we know life is much more complex than that. And humans are much more complex than that. So it's the same with flow. Flow actually should be relatively easy, but it's other things that we've learned along the way that interfere. Usually ourselves, our own criticism, our thoughts, we get in a way of ourselves. But the thing I wanted to say is flow is one of the things that comes naturally to us as children. All you have to do is look at a 6 or 7-year-old in an imaginary world. They could be in the middle of a supermarket and they're dancing around or they're talking to someone or they do not care what anyone else is thinking. They don't even know there's people around them. They are totally absorbed in the moment. It's a very natural state for all of us. But as we grow and learn and within the society we're in, I think we start to lose that capacity because we gain a certain amount of self-awareness, which is really, really important. You need that self-awareness, but you also need to be able to manage it so that it doesn't impede you in the progress you want to make. And there's another exciting thing from the neuroscience side of things. This is, for me, the kind of most exciting bit in terms of understanding flow. I think I've even talked to you about this before, but I certainly talk regularly for listeners that don't know, about brain health and about optimizing your brain function. And again, it's very similar to flow. It's about optimizing your life and your enjoyment in life and reaching your true potential. And I often say to people, our sense of self, our perception of the world is just the conscious part of our brain, which is a small part of your brain. You have huge capacity in the unconscious parts of your brain. And we often give too much credit to our conscious parts of our brain in terms of solving problems or trying to be creative. We try to force it. We keep saying, no, I can't go to sleep till I figure this one out. I have to sort this out. Oh, I wish I could think up another book that I could write or whatever, right? And you feel that you actively have to do that in order for it to happen. Now, when we're actively engaged in an activity, you have certain networks in your brain, which is groups of neural networks, being active together. And one of those is is associated with goal-directed action. So you're focused on a task and you're engaging in a task. Another one is when you are not engaged. What's really interesting, aside from the state of flow, when you're not actively engaged in a task, there is other networks in your brain that become much more active. So when you're sitting daydreaming, thinking you're doing nothing, the default mode network in your brain kicks in, right? And it's got it's a completely different group of neurons and connections that activate together. And I often say to people, look, daydream more. It also happens when we sleep. Go to sleep, rest more, because your unconscious parts of your brain are working away when your brain is in this default mode. And the brain loves patterns and it loves sequences. And, if you've given it the question or the problem, it has access to everything, every bit of knowledge you've ever encountered. And it can work away. It can work away and in the background without you consciously trying to force the solution to the problem. And suddenly you're in a shower or you're in the supermarket on the aisle and you go, oh my God, that's how I'll do it. That's the answer. That's what I need to do. And you can't wait to run back and finish the chapter of the book or do whatever you're doing. And that's because while your brain is just idling, is what some people call it, it's idling from our active kind of framework, but your unconscious part of your brain is working away. Now, that network and your goal-focused network are what we'd say inversely related. In other words, when the goal-focused network is engaged, this one is dampened down and vice versa. What the neuroscience is showing that I think is really exciting in terms of flow is that suddenly both networks actually start to work in sync together. And so you have this capacity when you're in flow of being completely focused on your goal, but you also have access to your creativity, your insight, and still a certain amount of self-awareness, because that's part of what Mihai talks about, is that you not only need clarity of your goal, you need to have clear feedback. So, a golfer in the moment will know when they hit the ball whether it's a good shot or not. That's an immediate feedback. So there's a certain element of awareness. So what neuroscience seems to say is that this flow state is just this wonderful balancing between these two states that allows you to achieve your goals whilst being creative as well. I find that really exciting. I don't know if you do.
Yeah, no, I do. Because as you say, they would seem to be at odds with each other a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Just on the daily experiences, I'm trying to think of times in my life when I've experienced it. Obviously, one of the reasons why as a stand-up comic you would want flow state is because that's when the really good gigs happen. Yeah. Because you feel like you've more time to think. Literally, time seems to slow down. Yes. So you've more time to plan what you're just about to say and pick jokes out of the future and, and think a few jokes ahead. You just seem to have more time. You feel like you're not harshly judging yourself as you're talking, which can happen, which can affect your performance.
Oh, yeah, totally interfere.
But I wonder, are there other, I guess,
everyday moments.
Yeah, so say somebody came to you with an issue.
Yeah.
And normally you might try and instantly problem solve it or be afraid or not know what to say, but you may experience a conversation where you just seem to know what the right things to say, or the conversation that maybe was difficult for you, you seem to just be in the moment in that. Maybe I'm picking a wrong example.
No. I mean, I experience it when I give talks. I give a lot of corporate wellness talks, and you always have that little buzz before. And I mean, I'm a former actor, so I mean, I totally understand, that the buzz before doing anything. I wasn't a huge fan of live theatre, but I loved working in television. And that's something that really is interesting on flow as well. But you're totally in the zone. But you asked about everyday examples. And basically Mihai gives one which is really, really good, and I have one from my own past, is that not everything we do in life is enjoyable, right? And flow is about enjoyment, enjoying the state. So we have no control over, really. We have a lot more control of our lives than we think we have. And that comes from within. Okay, so disasters happen, shit happens, there isn't a lot you can do about that in sort of the short term. That's not saying we can't do things about climate change or we can't look for, vaccines for COVID. That has to happen, and that's about our survival. But when stuff happens in your life that is very unpleasant, you can't change that stuff. If somebody dies, they die. You can't change that. But you can still enjoy life. You can still get to that state. And basically that's around how your perception, how you interpret the things that are happening in the outside world. So I think sometimes in terms of the pursuit of happiness, we often look outside ourselves. We look to change things that we don't like, or we think if we buy this or we achieve this, we'll feel happy. But actually it's much more... It's more going on inside you about how you respond to things. You still can aspire and work towards things, but it's about actually taking control and centering it within you. But there's one fabulous example that is in Mihai's book, and it's about and it's an everyday example. It's about a guy working in a factory, and I related to it because my first job was I worked in an Irish Life Assurance company in the pensions division, and this was before you had computers. I mean, we had a calculator, and the computer was on the second floor of the building because it was the entire second floor of the building.
Yeah.
And there was literally all the wheels. God, I'm making myself sound really old, but that's the truth of the matter. And I literally had a company that 500 employees. Every single year, we had to manually calculate how much money their employer had to put in to their fund, how much of a personal contribution they had to put in order to meet their retirement at whatever. So there was all these actuarial tables, everything. And you literally we had these pink cards, and there was about 45 calculations on each card for each year. And you had to take one of them down, you had to look up their salary, you had to look up this, you had to look up the actuarial thing, and you calculated everything and you wrote them down. And then you had to tot up each one, say, of the 500 employees for each of those 44 things.
Yeah.
Right? Mundane, awful, repetitive, etc. Now, the only reason I survived and coped was I would set myself time limits. I'd say, God, okay, right, I wonder how long I'm going to tell myself, how long does it take me to do 10 of them? And then I go, okay, that took me that. Okay, I'm going to try and do the next 10 a little bit quicker. Or, when I'm calculating, right? So I made it interesting and enjoyable for myself. I knew nothing about flow at this point, but that was the only way I could survive.
Yeah.
And keep my sanity. So the example that Mihai gives is a guy working on in a factory on a conveyor belt, and his job was to, I think it was like in a car factory or a stereo factory, he had to adjust the sound, that was his station, and he had 47 seconds to do that, right? And this man loved his job, right? But that's what he did. Twiddle this knob, twiddle this. Okay, next 47 seconds, twiddle, twiddle. Right. What he did was, he, again, like I kind of did in my simple way, he focused on bringing his time down. He loved his job because he was getting this kick every day. He eventually got his time down to 30 seconds from 47 seconds. And ultimately then he got it down to something about 27 seconds, and it was not possible to get it any further. At which point he decided to go and study and train to be a mechanical engineer and seek promotion in his job. So you can see the analogy with there's a certain point with athletes that they get that you can't run faster than that your age has changed or whatever. So it's time to turn and see what other challenge you can give yourself, what new skills you can give yourself to go on. So that's why I kind of talk about it as a journey. That's for the mundane stuff, because not everything can be enjoyable, but you can be there's no way you can speed up your time on even a mundane task without being totally immersed in it. You have your goal, you're getting your feedback. Did I get it in the time? And time is kind of distorted because you're there, in the moment as well.
So listening to that, flow state is almost an indicator of how much juice we're squeezing out of life at that particular time.
I think you're absolutely right. Flow is about getting the optimal enjoyment out of life. That's what it is. And it is about enjoying every moment.
At the start of this conversation, I thought that it was more for elite performers or for people who had particularly intense moments in their job or whatever they had to do throughout their day. Or maybe something that just happened in a crazy random moment of intensity.
Yeah, and that does happen, and that's slightly different. That's not the same as, sorry, to go back to that example you gave, it's not really the same as the flow state. I mean, we can experience flow. You might walk in, go hiking, and you get to the top of a hill and you look down and you go, oh my God, the view. And you're just lost in it. Those things happen. They're they're wonderful moments and savor them and enjoy them. But that's slightly different to that ongoing contented happiness, enjoyment that flow gives and brings. And I mean,
I guess buzz as well. I'm thinking of somebody maybe who works at a till in an incredibly busy department store, and they're like, oh, the customers keep coming and they're like, woo, and they're, ringing through all the orders. And at the end of it, they're feeling like, whoo, that was intense. They're almost high-fiving each other and going, wow, that was crazy. My God, how is it 5:30 already? But they're kind of buzzing after it, and they feel like they were challenged. They got through it, and they're I guess they were in a flow state during it, and now they're feeling kind of satisfied.
Yeah. So the thing is, it's the thing about flow is there's sort of this, well, these are the components, but there's no one thing that will give you, like what will give me a sense of flow can be entirely different to you. At the weekend, we sorted out our wood. There's two woodsheds in the house we moved to, and we kind of inherited a mess. And I just said, no, we're sorting this and that. And I mean, I'm talking about a lot of wood and like I sorted that out and I was in flow for about 5 hours solid going, no, I need to move that there. And if I move that there, then I'll be able to move that. And then we can sort and I got into a rhythm. And I mean, it was raining. We're going outside, getting wheelbarrows full. And I was literally in serious manual labour. I looked at, I think in the afternoon, I burnt 1,000 calories and I hadn't got my watch on for the morning. But like literally picking up logs of wood and putting them in. But then I was going, it challenged me mentally as well because I was going, well, where should I put that? I had to figure out the end result, the goal, what I wanted to achieve in the shed. And then I carried it out and I was in flow for the afternoon, I can honestly say. So it doesn't have to be. I've also had the experience of being in flow as an actor. And actually, more honestly, as an actor, I would say I knew when I was bad because I was aware of my performance, very aware of the way I would put it is, I knew I was acting when I could hear my own voice.
Yeah, I know that from
Do you know that feeling from doing stand-up?
And it's the worst because you're like, come back. You're almost like suddenly you zoom out and you're like, oh, look at you. You're performing. And you go, no, get back in my head.
It's not even that. It's just that you can actually hear what you're saying. And so therefore you're not like I always say, and I have written about it in other books and I write a lot about it in my next book because it is about, there's a couple of other concepts like flow. I mean, for me, one that jumps out is Ikigai. I don't know if you're familiar with Ikigai. It's the Japanese concept where when...
I thought it was a medical term.
Yeah, for an Ikigai. That's, again...
You've got icky eye disease.
Again, like Mihai, where I wrote down MEHIGH in order to pronounce it. I did the same for Ikigai and I spoke about, oh God, he's an Ikigai and that's how I remember it. It works. But basically, Ikigai is where four things meet and they actually illustrate it with a Venn diagram. So it's where four things interconnect and that is your passion, what you love doing, your mission, something that the world needs. I suppose the next thing, my fingers are clicking as I'm doing that. I suppose the next thing is your vocation, your skills, what you are good at. And the final one is your profession, something that you can be paid to do. So doing something that you love, that the world wants, that you're good at and they're prepared to pay you. That is Ikigai, when all of those come together. And in a way, that echoes sort of flow for me too, that, that would be ideal if you can do something that you love. I mean, that was my ultimate goal raising my kids, was I wanted them to find something that they loved doing. And this was before I read about all these things, but I just wanted for them to find something that they loved doing and find a way to get someone to pay them to do it.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is about, manifesting your goals. Again, they echo very closely to some of the things that are itemized in flow, like having a clarity of purpose, visualizing your goal, then a plan of action and making sure, another thing we didn't talk about is making sure that everything is aligned. In my book, I call it coherence, but that your actions, your thinking, your beliefs and your emotions are all on the same page. And that's kind of in a way where some of the barriers come in. If they're not
a lot of us
all aligned.
say we want one thing and we hope to do something, and someday I'll be doing, but actually our behavior, our actions are not aligned.
They're not speaking to it. And that's why I think as well, these are the things that can get in a way, that stop us being that child, that can just be totally immersed and oblivious, is that we learn things that are important life lessons to learn. I mean, you need to be aware when people are watching you, and you need to be aware of what behavior is appropriate in what situation. But then you also need to be able to switch those things off when you're doing things that you love, because at the end of the day, you've only got one life, and maximizing your potential and your enjoyment in that life is what's key. At the end of the day, does it really matter what somebody thinks? But it does matter in certain instances. That's the balance.
The trade-off, yeah.
Yeah. You know, I mean, you've got to live in a world that has rules, and you've got to be out of flow for some of the time. Do you know what I mean? But you can maximize the amount of time that you are in flow.
Well, isn't our time then outside of the flow state, rather than getting frustrated that we can't get back into it, isn't our time outside of flow then, when things all seem to be perfectly aligned, as crucially important as the flow state, in that the time we're out of flow, we're learning. We're learning things about maybe that, you know, bring us off course, our roadblocks we throw in our own way. And so that, you know, it's almost like the silence between the notes in a song. Actually, it's the times when things aren't in flow, that's actually where growth happens. And then the flow state is an indicator of alignment, that you've, you know, that
I think growth happens in both. I think one of the key components of flow is actually learning. I mean, it's called, I think he refers to it as challenge, you know, that you can surmount a challenge. You could he calls it becoming a more complex person. It's learning new things. I mean, that's harnessing neuroplasticity. So when you're in the flow, because you've got this what I call the Goldilocks sort of match, you know, between your skills and things, that's the place where learning occurs. So you learn and you get to the next level, so to speak. And so you need a new challenge for that to become enjoyable. You know, it is that's why it really is this constant progress. But you need to be out of the flow to consider your goals and the things that you want to achieve, and consider maybe who you really are. And as you said, understand. So for me, and I've done a lot of kind of work around this while I was writing my next book, is that whilst clarity is very important and often put down as the first step in gaining flow, or the first step in manifesting your goals, you know, being clear about what you want, I firmly believe that the first step is actually going into understanding yourself, who you are, and learning to be compassionate towards yourself, because we've gathered so much baggage along the way in our lives. Our sense of self is created by our brain, right? I always argue we are our brain, okay? And our self is a construction of our brain, and it is taken from various bits of information from across your lifespan. And some of that information is no longer valid. Some of it was never valid. Some of it is, you know, completely wrong or out of date. And frequently, who we think we are is influenced by what someone else thinks of us. So I think, you know, for me, and I would say this about flow as well, that before you start trying to get into states of flow, spend some time trying to get to know who you really are and what you really, really want, not who you think you should be, or, you know, actually really kind of question, why do I think I'm no good at that? Why do I think I can't do that? Is that actually valid? I spoke to someone for my book, and she had a lifelong belief. She's a very successful journalist and author, and she had a lifelong belief that she was bad at maths. And that transferred to her being absolutely crap with money. Anyway, she just believed it. Now I don't know if she'll ever listen to it, but I think she's late 30s, early 40s. And so she long held belief and really very positive, no, this is the way it is. Anyway, she was helping her mother move house to an apartment. And as when you move house, I've done it recently, you come across all this ancient stuff. So she found a box with all her school stuff. And there was her school report. She was top of the class in maths. She has no idea where she got the idea that she was bad at maths. But she's apparently not bad at maths. But she has lived her entire life in a way that reflects a person being bad at maths. So there's so many things that we pick up along the way that people who are important to us in childhood. I still remember things that my school teacher in my class said about me that came back to me through her children. Because that just broke my heart. And I remember it. Like they said, oh, my mum says we're not allowed to play with you because you're just a notice box. And I remember going, what's that? What's a notice box? Now, what it was, I was just, as I still am, really interested in everything. Oh, why does that happen? Teacher, why does that happen? But what teacher, if we did this? I also had started actually drama classes at the age of 8. So, that's kind of who I was, but that just completely influenced. It was just awful. I can still feel that awfulness.
It says a lot
I have
about
to be careful.
Sometimes the Irish psyche as well. That a notice box is somebody who's sort of gregarious and, as you say, enjoying life, and but it was considered.
Somehow, and don't play with her. She's just a notice box.
You should stay in your lane and don't make a fuss and don't draw attention to yourself. And you know,
and I had no
as I
intention
discussed
of
recently
even
with somebody who was the saying, "Oh, sure, don't mind them. They think they're great." Is another a very Irish one.
No, and I've written about that, and I know I'm saying it again, but just this is so relevant to the neuroscience of manifesting. Is that being full of yourself, being compassionate, loving yourself is the term. That's what it was. So,
they love themselves.
When I grew up, and I'm not sure whether this is a particularly Irish thing, and I actually kind of questioned myself in the book, is this a particularly Irish thing? But judging by the number of self-help books that are out there, I don't believe it can be particularly Irish. But when I grew up, and obviously clearly when you grew up, it's still there. Someone who loves themselves, it's a negative thing.
Yeah.
Oh, they love themselves. Oh, they think they're the bee's knees. Oh, they think. So loving yourself has always been a negative. So for me, and for I'm sure a lot of Irish people and a lot of people around the world, that sense of self-compassion, which is why I write and talk about self-compassion, is we have to learn it because we've unlearned it. We've learned that loving yourself is somehow a bad thing or it's a selfish thing to do. But unless you can be compassionate with yourself, you're not going to be able to get into flow, because when you're in flow, it actually doesn't matter if you make mistakes, because you see that as part of the learning process, the feedback, the self-correcting, the part of the journey. And there is research that shows that, the people are more compassionate about themselves. They're less hard on themselves for their failure, but they also make more progress. Whereas others of us are at certain times, we just get caught up on beating ourselves up. Yeah,
but beating yourself up is exhausting. And of course it'll slow you down. If
it's a form
instead of moving forward, you're stopping to hit yourself over the head. You're not going to make progress.
Yeah, no, it is absolutely a form of abuse. And we're the perpetrators. So, any other kind of abuse, we'd be standing up in arms and saying, no, hold on, this has to stop. But it really does have to stop, because, and it's not easy. But I think it's really important. And I think kind of that kind of journey into yourself. And I think there's so much linked with, with meditation and present-mindedness that can center you and allow you then examine yourself in a non-judgmental way that I think is hugely important for any of these steps. So, I mean, anyone listening, I'd say, if you want to get into flow, you probably already are, in flow. And, anytime you do anything where you don't notice the time passing, you're experiencing flow, really. You're getting satisfaction, enjoying. And that can be painting the bedroom. do you know what I mean?
Gardening does it for me. And I didn't think I liked gardening. But I definitely get into flow state and I feel amazing after it.
Yeah. And that's another thing as well.
It only happens twice a year though.
Well, I have to garden all the time now. And I love it. And that's an interesting thing. So and I'm kind of glad you brought that up. So some states of flow, like say your ballerina pirouetting, who feels like the millisecond of the pirouette is for ages and just gets this immediate, oh my God, I did it, I achieved it. You can still have flow that has a long-term reward. So I can't tell you, we're in the middle of winter. My garden is fabulous all year round. I haven't created the garden. I see it as the what's the
curator.
word? The curator of that garden. I'm trying to make it better so that it will survive for whoever owns the beautiful place I've moved to since then. But the first year was just a wonder because we bought the house in winter. So it's like in January walking in and go, oh my God, look at the snowdrops. Oh, there's snowdrops all over that lawn. So I learned the house in the first year. Now I know what's really important to care for and look after because I know the joy that will come. So I know there's certain things that I'm doing now that then one day in March I'll walk along and go, look, my pruning worked. The hydrangea is flowering beautifully again. And so that's your longer term kick from flow. But I enjoyed the moment of cutting. I mean, I love pruning. I enjoy that moment of cutting that stuff. But I also get this fabulous reward of that's kind of delayed as well. Yeah, I mean, it really is just... It's the moment. Yeah, it's being in the moment. And do you know what's interesting, given your focus on mindfulness? I've always been that person that struggles with that kind of meditation, mindfulness. Now I do it and I breathe. I use breath a lot. And that's actually a great way to get into flow, actually, is connecting with your breath. Because when you're connected with your breath, it's kind of hard to think of anything else. And that's why, so I used to find going to the gym, I don't go to the gym anymore, but I used to find going to the gym was my form of meditation. Because if you're lifting weights on the bar, or you're doing deadlifts or whatever, you can't focus on anything else. You have to be there. You have to be very conscious of where your body is placed so you don't hurt yourself. You're breathing, you have a challenge. There's no point in going to gym and lifting 5K weights, because you're not going to get anything out of it. You have to keep upping those weights. So like weightlifting for me was kind of like that, being in the flow. So I've always said to people as well that, being in the moment, mindfulness doesn't have to be about sitting and breathing and being calm. You can gain incredible benefits by being in the moment of an activity that can be a form of meditation in itself if you're totally focused. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, I would, yeah. And a lot of people would say to me, look, I just can't sit still. I just find it too hard.
Yeah.
And I get agitated and I'm actually more anxious by the time I finish it.
Yeah.
And I would always say, okay, well, is there anything that you used to do where you lost track of time that you don't do anymore? And maybe it was playing the guitar. Maybe it was just going out with a hurley and a schlitter or whatever it happened to be. Maybe it was pruning the hedges.
Yeah.
Who knows? But, I'm a firm believer in I think most people know themselves what's good for them and what helps their brain and their nervous systems. But a lot of the time, they're the first things that we put a line through when we get busy.
Exactly.
So even if you can't sit still or focusing on your breath seems to make you even more anxious, then, go for a mindful walk. Look,
Yeah. And walking, engaging the physical part of your body is a great way actually to kind of get mindful as well as the breath. There's or to get in the flow. And I mean, you see, I kind of see flow and passion, finding your what I call it, or I have called it, finding your joy. which is the exact same as flow, because that's supposed to be about enjoy, And some people will say to me, I have no idea what that is. I'm not passionate about anything. There isn't anything. And I said, well, that's not the human condition. There is something. It's just you haven't done it for a very long time. And I've said, even if you have to go back to your childhood, what was the thing that when your mother called you for dinner and she'd turn around and say to you, I've just called you 3 times, and you never heard it? Whatever that activity was, start with that. It could be something as simple as reading. Reading a book is a very classic example of flow.
Do phones rob us of that flow state, do you think? Does technology, screens, that kind of digital distraction?
I was thinking about that driving in, actually. I spend a lot of time on my laptop, right? And I know other people, and I won't mention names, spend a lot of time scrolling on phones. Now, to any outsider, whether it's the phone or the laptop, to any outsider, the two of us are mindlessly scrolling. Now, I know one person stays up till 3 o'clock in the morning on TikTok. I'm not mindlessly scrolling. I am working towards my goals, whether that goal is decorating the interior of my house, whether it's planning, I don't know, even Christmas presents, or, planning what I'm going to do today. I am actively engaged in a task that takes me to my next goal when I'm on the internet. But it might look like I'm mindlessly scrolling. I'll often scroll. So I love interior design. If I wasn't a psychologist and neuroscientist, that's what I would do. I just love the whole creative process of it. That involves scrolling sometimes, but that is information gathering. So I love to look at houses that are on the market for sale, and I'll click through because, look at that. Let's see what they did there. Or, scroll through paint ideas or images. Sometimes I'll take screenshots of them. Sometimes I'll make mood boards, but they go in my brain and they will come back when I want an idea for how I'm going to do such and such a room or whatever. So I think there's mindful use of technology and there's mindless use of technology. And I think you would be far better going for a walk than mindlessly scrolling. I think there's a place for technology. I can't imagine how I would write any of my books if I didn't have internet and the access to online journals. Oh my God, I don't know how people used to write books. They would actually have to go into a library, get the journal article, whereas I can have it and then I can call it back up again and, and it's on my screen. So every advance that we've made as humans has set alarm bells ringing. Even writing set Plato's alarm bells ringing because he said it would destroy human memory. Because if you could write stuff down, then you would no longer have to remember all the great important things. But actually what writing did allowed us to be able to have a place where you could go to find that information, freeing up more space in your brain to create new things, etc., instead of using it all up to try and just remember stuff that was already there. I think the same applies with technology. If you use it to create things or to be innovative or to rise to challenges or to learn, then it's hugely beneficial. But I do have a kind of moral and ethical concern about social media, because social media and some of the associated technologies, everything we interact with changes our brain. And a lot of the people who have developed things like social media are very aware of that. They harness the reward system. They give you your dopamine hit. Oh, and by the way, the dopamine system in the brain has increased activity during flow. Did I say that already? Maybe I did. But basically, all those little things of clicking a like or the sound even your phone makes, they're all designed to activate the reward system. So the people who have designed these apps and these systems, they know how our brain works and they're manipulating how our brain works. And they're also manipulating the content that they're exposing to us, which in turn changes important things like attitudes and behaviors, and also feeds into those things of disliking how you look as an individual because there's only one perfect type of female body or whatever. And I kind of think of the internet a bit like the atom bomb. The scientists who invented it had very good intentions. And if you focus on social media, it was to give people a free place to interact, be creative, be heard, be seen. It has now evolved into quite the reverse. I used to be very active, and I'm not now because it's become a place where you can be shut down, cancelled. You're not allowed to have any opinions unless they're belonging to a certain, and it's a bullying ground. It's that thing in psychology, it's that cloak of an anonymity, and people can do things that they would never ever do face to face. So I think the internet has exploded in a negative way, much like splitting the atom was used in a negative way. And I do think that we need to enforce guidelines, rules. You cannot take, a medical tablet that can act on your central nervous system without it having gone through numerous phases of clinical trials. Yet the internet can change how your brain reacts, and nobody has tested the unintended consequences or the intended consequences. There's no warning label. There's nothing. It's just freely available, and that concerns me,
Sabina, I could talk to you all day. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I think people have a better understanding of flow state and actually its role in our general feeling of how we're flowing through our own lives, which I think is lovely. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.